Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 23rd of May of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the most important topic of the previous 24 hours, about the prisoner exchange process. The first stage of a large-scale exchange of prisoners of war has begun at the border according to the formula 1000 for 1000. The 1000 for 1000 prisoner exchange between Ukraine and Russia will last 3 days. So this is very important information that today was published by different sources, but also today we got a very interesting statement that was made by the President of the United States of America. A major prisoner swap was just completed between Russia and Ukraine. It will go into effect shortly. Congratulations to both sides on this negotiation. This could lead to something big. This was stated by the President of the United States of America, and as you can see, we have some gap. Trump stated that the entire process has finished, but when talking about details, we see that this 1000 for 1000 exchange will last 3 days. So the Russians will split this 1000 for several groups, and according to information we have, by the end of the 23rd of May of 2025, 270 soldiers were returned back to the territory of Russia and to the territory of Ukraine, as well as 120 civilians, once again both to the territory of the Russian Federation and to Ukraine. You know that this is very interesting, and this statement of Trump is also very interesting. The thing is that I would like to remind you that during the previous few days the Ukrainians carried out massive drone strike all over the entire territory of the Russian Federation, and the Ukrainians were trying to hit the capital of the Russian Federation, the city of Moscow. And today, for example, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported and stated that in the course of repelling of a massive Ukrainian drone attack, the Russian air defense systems brought down 1,177 drones, including 788 of them outside the special military operation zone. So obviously the Russians had the right to quit this negotiation process and to postpone this 1000 for 1000 exchange, but the Russians decided not to do this. And obviously this statement that was made by the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, that this process has already been finished. This is not something like a statement or something like a mistake from the side of the President of the United States of America. This is something like guarantees. This is something like guarantees that this process will be finished. Maybe in 2 parts, in 3 parts, in 2, 3, or 5 days, but this process will be finished. Because now, if anybody decides to quit this process, let's say either the Russians or the Ukrainians due to some reasons, let's say like massive missile strike, then this will lead to the situation that Donald Trump says something that it has nothing common with the reality. So that is why we think that now neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, neither Putin nor Zelensky wants to have bad relations with Donald Trump. So that is why we see that this 1000 for 1000 exchange will be finished, maybe not today, but probably tomorrow or maybe the day after tomorrow. So this is the situation, and this is very important, very huge step towards the peaceful settlement of the conflict. But now we need to understand one important thing, that's talks in Istanbul finished several days ago, and the first step of this peaceful settlement was this prisoner exchange process, and we see that both the Russians and the Ukrainians finished this first step successfully. Now the parties are in front of the second step, and this is very important thing, and the question is not what kind of second step the parties are going to create or are going to face. The most important that despite the number of steps that both sides are going to make, it is very important that sooner or later Putin and Zelensky, or Putin or someone else from the Ukrainian side, will sit in the same office and will sign this let's say agreement, this peaceful settlement agreement. So, and that is why today the Russian authorities, more precisely Sergei Lavrov, the head of Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, made lots of very important statements, because he understands that this is going to happen soon and the Russians don't want to have problem with this. the Russians reported that the issue of Zelensky's legitimacy will be of fundamental importance when it comes to signing a peace agreement. So the Russians are trying to tell Zelensky, are trying to say that it's better to start the election process right now. So maybe the talks and negotiations between Russia and Ukraine will be finished, let's say, in 6 months. And it is good that if by this time Zelensky will have some legitimacy, or probably somebody else. But as for the situation in Ukraine right now, we don't see that anybody is doing anything about this. And obviously, when time comes, this is going to be a very huge issue between the Russians and the Ukrainians. But when talking about Ukrainians, most likely this is going to be an issue for them, because it is they who will not be able to sign anything. When talking about the Russian side, they don't see any issue with this, because and the Russians continue their preparation to begin offensive operation with the purpose to create a secure zone along the entire border between Russia and Ukraine, from, let's say, the city of Chernihiv till the city of Kupyansk. And this was stated yesterday by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. A decision has been made to create a security buffer zone along the border between Russia and Ukraine. And you know that Russians are saying about a secure zone, but today several very reliable pro-Ukrainian commanders of different brigades, including the 3rd Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, stated that there are going to be no secure zone in this area. They're going to be all these regions taken by the Russians. So it's time to start thinking about this. And if the Russians are saying that Zelensky and Ukraine must carry out elections, it's better to start thinking about this, because then most likely nobody is going to have additional time for anything. Anyway, let's return back to Ukraine and let's discuss the situation on the ground, because during the previous 24 hours we got lots of unexpected and very interesting updates. And first, let's talk about the northern Kupyansk direction, because during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their position significantly to the north of the city of Kupyansk. Today, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, more precisely the units of the Group of Forces West, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Radkivka. So this is exactly the village that was taken by the Russians. You know that by the end of the 23rd of May of 2025, many mappers adjusted their maps, and we did the same. But telling the truth, right now, nobody knows for sure how exactly the Russians answered this settlement, and everybody added adjustments to their maps softly. We did the same. We don't know for sure how exactly the Russians answered the village of Radkivka. During the previous 24 hours we got reports from pro-Ukrainian sources and from pro-Russian resources that the Russians managed to answer the village of Kondrashevka from the northeast, and to establish control over the most northeastern part of the settlement. Something like this was stated today by several pro-Russian resources. And telling the truth, I expected that the Russians are going to advance further in the south and the southwestern direction, losing something like this, using these roads of attack. But unexpectedly, the Russians reported that without control over the village of Kondrashevka, the Russians secured the village of Radkivka. So, summarizing everything, we believe that the Russians most likely attacked the village of Radkivka using these roads of attack. The Russians moved in the direction of the village along these three lines, and they managed to capture this territory. And which is the most important, the Russians managed to establish physical control over R79 road, and now the Ukrainians are no longer available to send their units and forces along this R79 road in the northwestern direction. So basically a very big, very huge part of Ukraine, more precisely of the northeastern part of Ukraine, currently without any supply and support. So we are talking about this part, and we expect that the Russians will intensify their activities in this area. As of the end of the 23rd of May, nothing is happening here. So let's return back to the settlement of Kondrashevka. So the Russians cut the road. Now most likely they will try to finish the battle for the village of Kondrashevka itself. We expect very heavy clashes in the near future. As of the end of the 23rd of May, we have this video, and in this video we can see how the Russians were bombing the most southwestern, the southern part of the settlement with most likely Southland tower systems or with FABs. So based on this video, we came to the conclusion that Ukrainians most likely controlled just this part of the settlement in the vicinity of this and this stronghold, but due to the situation in Radkivka and northeastern part of Kondrashovka, we expect that Ukrainians would fall back further in the western directions towards the railways. So the Russians most likely will shorten the lines, will maintain the lines in this area, and then the Russians will move further in the western direction, first to the village of Tishenkovka, and most likely the Russians will try to attack from Radkivka in the direction of Mirna, trying to improve their positions and trying to outflank the city of Kupyansk using broad front line attack with the purpose to establish as big as possible foothold to the north and to the northwest of the city of Kupyansk. So we can expect something like this. Of course, the Russians will try to move further in the northern direction and the northwestern direction with the purpose to maintain the lines and to connect the villages of Doroshivka and, let's say, the northwestern part of the city of Kupyansk, because if the Russians continue just to attack in this area, they could be caught in cauldron by the Ukrainians by counterattacks. Anyway, we see that the situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult in the city of Kupyansk, but what is more difficult is the situation for the Ukrainians that are currently located on the most eastern part of this pocket. Now the Ukrainians need to understand, and they understand this one, they understand clearly that they need to stick as close as possible to the evacuation roads, because anytime soon the Russians can break through Ukrainian defense, and these Ukrainians gonna have to be very fast to move in the western direction with the purpose to cross the river of Oskol and, let's say, to retreat towards more reliable positions. At the same time, I'll remind you that the northern part of the Kupyansk is not the only problem for Ukrainian. I expect that there is another very difficult area for the Ukrainians to the south of the city of Kupyansk in the vicinity of Sinkova. I'll remind you that during the previous months we got lots of reports that several Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups were already on the Ukrainian side of the river. We don't know for sure whether the Russians have strong positions there, but they have access to this area, because if the Russians cross the river of Oskol from the southern part of the city of Kupyansk, this might lead to complete collapse and to biggest disaster ever since the beginning of the special military operation. The Ukrainians have a very big and powerful army on the territory of the city, especially on the Russian side of the river of Oskol, and if this group of forces is encircled, this can lead to unpredictable consequences, not just for the front line, but also to Zelensky and his authorities who are currently located in the city of Kiev. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupyansk direction, or in the direction of the city of Lyman. According to information we have, there are still very heavy clashes for the settlement of Tarskoye. Pro-Ukrainian sources reported and published several geolocations that the Russian-Ukrainians counterattacked, and first Ukrainians managed to take under complete control the northern streets basically at the beginning, and by this attack the Ukrainians managed to cut the central part of the city of Tarskoye from supplying support from the north, and now Ukrainians, according to information we have, counterattacked the Russian positions in the central part and also managed to establish control over this territory. This video was published by a very reliable pro-Russian resource, and here we can see how Russians were attacking Ukrainian positions in the central part of the city. So we see that Ukrainians most likely carry out successful counterattacks and partially restore control over the village. When talking about the Russian resources, several of them reported that indeed the situation in Tarskoye is very critical. The Russians were forced to fall back, and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported a few days ago that the village was captured by the Russians, but several very reliable pro-Russian resources reported that that piece of news was too early. It's too early to say that the village was taken. There are still very heavy clashes, and the Ukrainians are counterattacking, and most likely the Russians are forced to fall back. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the Konstantinovka direction. As you can see, we have lots of geolocations exactly to the east and to the southeast of Konstantinovka. There are very heavy clashes in this area, but without any changes on the ground. The Russians, as of the 23rd of May, were completely concentrated on discovering Ukrainian positions and on destroying them with FPV drones, artillery and aviation strikes. So the Russians are preparing this foothold before further operation on the ground. But as for this operation itself, there were no movements, no progress on the ground during the previous 24 hours. Now let's talk about the Kliban-Byksky pocket. We have lots of interesting details. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources for the first time confirmed that the Russians managed to enter the village of Romanovka. This information was provided by pro-Ukrainian sources Deep State, which means that indeed there are very heavy clashes for the village of Romanovka right now. There are most likely the Ukrainians control the most western part. The Russians managed to dig in deeper in the eastern part. The Russians are trying to increase the pressure because it is very important and decisive for the Russians to cut N20 road. If the Russians are able to do this and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, then we can start counting days for this entire pocket. But as for the end of the 23rd of May, we see that the Ukrainians still control this area. When talking about the western flank, the Russians continue offensive operation in the direction of the village by the name of Yablunovka and Alexandra Shultina along these rivers and along these tree lines. According to information we have, during the past 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions. This is, for example, the map configuration of the map by the end of the 22nd of May, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 23rd of May. The Russians improved their positions and the Russians continue offensive operation further. Most likely during the next 48 hours, all these tree lines would be taken by the Russians and the battle for the outskirts of Yablunovka will begin. Now let's move further and let's talk about the situation along N32 road. From this area we got lots of very important updates. First of all, once again, this is another area where the pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed additional changes on the ground in Russian favor. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians managed to outflank these anti-tank ditches, this red line, and to take under control this tree line completely. So this is very important because several strongholds are currently behind the Russian positions, and now the Russians will be able to take these strongholds in pincers and to establish complete control over them. This will allow the Russians to take under complete control this road that connects the, let's say, the village of Malinovka and this, let's say, the village of Berezovka, and Russian possible offensive further in the northern directions towards POW Yar. So very important strongholds were outflanked by the Russians, as you can see. This information was confirmed by neutral mappers, by pro-Russian resources, and by pro-Ukrainian resources. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians took under control several pounds further in the western direction. We are talking about this territory. As of the end of the 23rd of May, just the Russian resources confirmed this information. Neither neutral or pro-Ukrainians reported about this or something like this. Currently, there are very heavy clashes for the central part of Malinovka. The Ukrainians are counter-attacking the Russians with the purpose to force the Russians to fall back and to restore control over this area. The thing is that this dense network of fortifications is very important, and the Russians are trying to cut this complex network of fortifications from supply and support and from evacuation road. In these fields, there are lots of vehicles, troopers, and many different and very expensive equipment of the Western production. In this video, we can see, for example, how another Ukrainian tank crew was trying to escape this pocket, but this tank was discovered and destroyed by the Russian FPV drone immediately. So we can just imagine how many units the Ukrainians have in this pocket, and currently the clashes are taking place for this territory. If the Russians are able to take this territory under complete control and to cut these, let's say, trenches from the mainland, this is going to be another disaster. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. Today we got very important updates from this area. As you can see, we have adjusted the map, and we adjusted the map because pro-Russian resources published very important videos. Today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation didn't say anything about this situation, but today, probably by the end of the day, several pro-Russian resources published this video, and in this video we can see how the clashes for the village of Vostok have been taking place. In this video we can see how the Russians, in the first part of the video we can see how the Russians were bombing Ukrainian positions, we can see artillery preparation, and in the final part of this video we can see lots of Russian soldiers that raised lots of Russian flags in many places of the village of Odradne. Based on this video and based on this number of updates, we see that we have no doubts that the village was taken by the Russians completely, and the most important is that one of the flags that the Russians raised during this video was was raised exactly in the most western part in these farms. Based on this video, once again, we have adjusted the map. We see that Ukrainians were forced to fall back from this area further in the western direction towards the village of Kamar. Now we can see that there is a very huge gap in these fields and tree lines, and probably completely unsecured and completely unprotected. The Russians will continue advancing further in this area with the purpose to attack the settlement of Alexeyevka from behind. We expect that after the fall of Odradne, the Russians will move their focus in the northern direction with the purpose to attack the villages Zelený Kut, Novoukrainka, Dachna, and Alexeyevka from behind. Furthermore, we remember and we know that the Russians almost every single day are moving through these fields in the southern direction. So basically, with the fall of the village of Odradne, the battle for Alexeyevka has begun. So let's wait for progress and additional details from this area in the very near future. When talking about the Gulyai-Polye direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got several reports that the Russians secured the village of Zelenoye Polye and the village of Novopol completely, as you can see, without any proofs, without any videos, and without Ministry of Defense report. But we expect this information tomorrow, and tomorrow most likely these two villages would be colored in Russian favor. This is the road of attack towards the city by the name of Gulyai-Polye, and as the first task and the first target of this offensive is the village of Uspenovka. This is the primary target for the Russians, because if the Russians are able to take under control this village, this will allow the Russians to cut the village of Gulyai-Polye, the stronghold of Gulyai-Polye, into operational encirclement. Supply lines will be cut, will be taken under complete control, and the situation will become very difficult for the Ukrainians in this area. As for the Zaporozhye direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got just one video. The Russians managed to discover several planes, very simple planes of the armored forces of Ukraine that they were using to bring down Russian drones of Geraint type. And as a result of Iskander strike, the Russians destroyed this airfield with those planes. So we are waiting for the next waves of prisoner exchange process, and we are waiting for additional meeting and additional statements from the Russian and from the Ukrainian side. And of course, we are waiting for the beginning of the secure zone offensive operation from the Russian forces. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.